On the night of December 11, 2008, inside a $7 million Manhattan penthouse, Bernie Madoff, the most respected man on Wall Street, sat his two grown sons down in the living room. There was no ceremony, no emotion. He looked at them the way a doctor looks at a patient before breaking some bad news. And then he said the words that detonated 3 decades of lies. It's all just one big lie. His sons froze. They thought he was joking. But Bernie didn't joke. He continued, almost annoyed he had to explain this. There's no investment. There's no strategy. It's all fake. All of it. He told them he'd been paying old investors with new money, that the entire empire, the hedge fund, the legendary returns, the impenetrable aura of genius, was nothing but a Ponzi scheme. Not a small one, but the largest financial fraud in human history. $64.8 billion. All of these took place in the Lipstick Building on East 53rd Street, where Madoff ran his legitimate market-making and trading business from the 19th floor, while the entire Ponzi scheme was being run 2 floors below on the 17th floor. Same building, same elevator. One side of Bernie making real trades, the other side printing fake ones. The world's most trusted financial icon, running the world's most devastating con. This is the story of the man who stole $65 billion and went to sleep like nothing happened. This is the story of the most trusted man on Wall Street, who ran the longest, largest, and most devastating con in financial history. Before he became the patron saint of financial crime, Bernie Madoff was a star, a real one. He wasn't some nobody running boiler room scams. He built a legitimate business, he earned credibility, and he played the long game. It started in 1960, when 22-year-old Bernie took $5,000 savings from lifeguarding and installing sprinkler systems and opened Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. To understand why people trusted him, you need to understand one thing. Bernie wasn't pretending to be a good trader. He actually was a good trader. Not extraordinary, not legendary, but smart, early, hungry, ahead of the curve. While Wall Street was still stuck in the analog era, shouting on trading floors, passing order slips like it was a bakery queue, Bernie embraced electronic trading long before it was cool. He built algorithms. He automated order flow. He brought speed to a system powered by human chaos. He became a pioneer of what Wall Street now considers standard: computers matching buyers and sellers. He was the kind of guy who could walk into a room full of old-school brokers and tell them, the future is electronic. And the crazy part? He was right. By the 1980s, Bernie wasn't just a successful market maker, he was one of the biggest players in the entire system. His firm routinely handled up to 10% of all NYSE trading volume. That's absurd. That's like one guy running 10% of Amazon's warehouse operations from his garage. And Wall Street rewarded him. He became a founding father of NASDAQ. He became chairman, not once, but 3 times. He was considered the adult in the room, the reliable guy, the man who symbolized the shift from old Wall Street to modern finance. Imagine being so respected that you don't just enter the club, you design the club. The man was a myth, a whisper, a god. So when he quietly told wealthy friends, country club contacts, and hedge fund insiders, "I run a private investment advisory business, strictly invitation only," people didn't question it. They begged for access. Because when the chairman of NASDAQ, the man who helped invent electronic trading, offers you a chance to get in on something special, you don't ask for paperwork. You don't ask for risk disclosures. You don't ask for performance audits. You just say, "Where do I wire the money?" And that's exactly how Bernie wanted it, because building the legend wasn't an accident. It was step one. But the next step, the one no one saw coming, was happening just a few floors below the legitimate business that made him famous. A floor locked with special keys, a staff handpicked for loyalty, not skill, a trading strategy that didn't trade, and a computer system that belonged in a museum. So how did Bernie turn a respected empire into the largest criminal operation in financial history? Let's walk down to the 17th floor. If the 19th floor of the Lipstick Building was Wall Street's Disneyland, the 17th floor was where the haunted animatronics lived. No signage, no foot traffic, no windows. Just a beige office filled with the hum of outdated technology and the smell of decades-old paper. This wasn't an advisory business. This was a crime scene. It's almost poetic. The biggest Ponzi scheme in history was run on a 1980s IBM AS400 mainframe, a machine so old that NASA wouldn't even use it to simulate moon landings anymore. And yet this relic spit out billions in imaginary profits. Fake trades, fake timestamps, fake positions, fake everything. All printed on continuous feed paper, that long perforated stuff no one uses anymore. The 17th floor staff didn't need Wall Street expertise. They needed loyalty. Some didn't even fully understand what they were doing. They were told to generate statements, print trade confirmations, update balances. A few employees joked they were printing money. They didn't realize that's exactly what they were doing. Bernie's supposed strategy was called the split strike conversion. It sounded sophisticated. It had graphs, it had options, it had hedging. It was complete fiction. Here's how it supposedly worked. Buy a basket of blue-chip stocks, buy put options to limit downside, sell call options to generate income. A classic options collar. Smart, conservative, boring. The kind of strategy you'd pitch to your mother-in-law. There was one issue. Bernie never executed a single one of those trades. Not once. Not one option contract, not one share in the quantities printed on client statements. Nothing. The entire position list was forged. And the timestamps? Sometimes they showed trades at prices the market never hit that day. Optically flawless, mathematically impossible. Bernie wasn't trying to beat the market. He was trying to impersonate it. From the 17th floor, Bernie delivered 1.2% a month, every month for decades. Flat, steady, eerily smooth, the financial equivalent of a heartbeat that never spikes, never drops. No volatility, no drawdowns, no correlation to any global event. The S&P 500 wishes it had that kind of consistency. So how did one man generate impossible returns for decades with no trades, no strategy, and no risk? The answer is, he didn't. And yet, people kept giving him money. A lot of people. Because the next part of the story explains the psychological fuel of any great con. If you build the illusion of exclusivity, the wealthy will line up to be deceived. To understand how the Ponzi got so big, you need to look at the people who made it possible. Bernie didn't recruit most of his victims. His victims recruited him. Feeder funds, third-party firms that pooled investor money, became Madoff's oxygen supply. They brought him billions. Palm Beach country clubs, old-money European aristocrats, Jewish charities, celebrities, Fortune 500 executives. They weren't just investors, they were evangelists. They told their friends, you have to get into Madoff's fund, but he doesn't take just anyone. Bernie cultivated that like a bonsai tree. He made people beg for access. He turned investing into a status symbol. He let social pressure do the marketing for him. The result? Entire communities put their life savings into a black box they never questioned. Because who questions a miracle? So how did a fraud this obvious survive scrutiny from the biggest banks, the smartest investors, and the federal regulators whose job was to stop it? Because one man did figure it out, as early as 1999, and he spent the next 9 years screaming into a void that refused to listen.
Before we get to the man who tried to stop Bernie, we need to appreciate just how absurd, borderline supernatural Madoff's performance really was. Because the numbers alone should have ended the scheme before it ever began. But instead, they became the bait. For example, Bernie Madoff reported 10 to 18% returns every single year. Rain or shine, bull or bear, dot-com crash, plus 10%, 9/11, plus 11%, 2002 recession, plus 12%, 2008 meltdown, still green. Not beating the market, defying it. This wasn't outperformance, this was wizardry. And somehow, the entire financial establishment nodded along like this was completely reasonable. It would have been less suspicious if he claimed to turn water into wine. Because here's the brutal truth about investing. Real returns are messy. Markets have drawdowns. Strategies break. Volatility hits everyone. Bernie's returns didn't behave like investments. They behaved like a thermostat, set to the perfect temperature and never moving. The smartest people in finance should have noticed. Some did, but most chose not to. Because when someone hands you miracle profits wrapped in consistency, you don't ask questions. You cash the check. So, who did ask questions? Who put the pieces together? Who spotted the lie years before the entire world realized it? That honor belongs to one man. And he wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't a hedge fund legend. He wasn't a Wall Street insider. He was a quantitative analyst from Boston, armed with a calculator, a pencil, and the willingness to be hated. His name was Harry Markopolos. In 1999, Harry Markopolos was working at a small investment firm in Boston. His boss came in one morning with a simple request. "Harry, can you replicate Madoff's strategy? He's doing 1% a month like clockwork. Clients want it." Harry takes one look at the numbers. One look. And he decides within 5 minutes that the performance is impossible. His exact thought? This is either the world's greatest trader or a complete fraud. And the world doesn't have that many great traders. He tries to replicate the split strike conversion results using real market data. It doesn't work. He changes assumptions. Still doesn't work. He changes volatility. Still doesn't work. He tries adjusting transaction costs, trade timing, hedging ratios. Nothing works. He realizes something devastating. The only way to replicate Madoff's returns is to make them up. So Harry does what any responsible financial professional would do. He warns the SEC. He writes a detailed memo. He explains that Madoff's strategy is mathematically impossible. He maps out 29 red flags. He labels the memo, "The world's largest hedge fund is a fraud," and he sends it to the regulators. And the SEC responds with a deafening silence. The SEC does nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a single phone call, not an interview, not an audit. But Harry isn't done. He becomes obsessed. He spends the next 9 years, 9 whole years, gathering evidence, building models, analyzing flows, comparing mismatched trade prints, interviewing suspicious brokers. He submits more reports, more warnings, more red flags. 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. He practically begs the SEC to investigate. And every time, Wall Street's referees shrug and say, "We're sure everything is fine." Bernie Madoff is a respected figure. The nuclear irony? One of the SEC examiners assigned to review Madoff later became his daughter-in-law. Harry Markopolos predicted the collapse of the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. He delivered the evidence on a silver platter. And the people in charge of enforcing the law, they chose to trust the legend instead of the math. So the question becomes, why were so many people willing to look the other way? Why did everyone, from regulators to billionaires, suspend disbelief? Because Bernie didn't just sell returns, he sold comfort. And comfort is the most addictive substance in finance. Now, let's talk about how Bernie lived, because that's the key to a successful con. You don't show off too much, just enough to appear successful without being obnoxious. And Bernie mastered this like a criminal Picasso. He wasn't buying Bugattis and gold-plated hot tubs. He lived like what he pretended to be, a wealthy, sophisticated, slightly boring financial patriarch, enjoying life at his luxurious home, the Manhattan penthouse. This was where the confession happened. Sleek, minimal, expensive without screaming luxury. The kind of place where you trust someone. Madoff also owned a $65 million yacht, Bull. Yes, that was its name. Bull. He moored it in the Mediterranean near his villa in Cap d'Antibes. And then there was Montauk, a seaside fortress used for family gatherings and holidays. A sanctuary where nobody suspected they were sitting on stolen retirement money. His wife Ruth Madoff lived the quiet luxury life. $100K monthly Amex bills, designer clothes, a life of privilege, funded entirely by fraud. But Ruth always claimed she had no idea. Bernie didn't flaunt his wealth to seem impressive. He flaunted it to seem normal. Because wealthy investors trust people who look like them. If Bernie lived too lavishly, he looked like a crook. If he lived too modestly, he looked like he was broke. So he found the perfect balance. The lifestyle wasn't a reward. It was a costume. A curated image designed to keep billionaires comfortable, regulators asleep, and suspicion away. But here's the problem with Ponzi schemes. They only work when money flows in. And in 2008, money started flowing out. Fast. So how does the largest con in financial history end? It starts with the request Bernie couldn't fulfill and ends at 4:59 a.m. with handcuffs clicking in the dark. By late 2008, the world was on fire. Lehman Brothers had collapsed. AIG was cratering. The credit markets were seizing up like a dying engine. Investors everywhere were scrambling for liquidity. And that's when the impossible happened. Bernie Madoff's clients wanted their money back. Not profits, not withdrawals, not small redemptions. They wanted everything. Because the financial crisis wasn't just a market crash. It was a stress test. And stress tests tend to expose whatever's rotten underneath. Bernie's investors asked for $7 billion. One small issue. Bernie had only $300 million left. Not $3 billion, not $1 billion, $300 million, against a $7 billion redemption request. The Ponzi had hit the wall. There were no new investors to bail him out, no fresh inflows, no extension of the illusion. The machine that ran flawlessly for 30 years stalled and died. It's December. Bernie is pacing the office. He knows it's over. But the way he tries to end the story is one of the darkest twists of all. He calls his longtime lawyer. He calls his accountant. Both men insist he comes clean, whatever that means after 3 decades of lies. But Bernie has a different idea. He decides he's going to pay out the last $300 million to select employees and family members quietly. His justification? They deserved it. He tells his top executives to expect bonuses, not from profits, not from reserves, from the last drops of stolen money. This wasn't an exit strategy. It was looters emptying the store before the lights go out. In the days before the confession, Bernie packs a bag with watches, jewelry, and personal documents. He hands it to his wife Ruth and instructs her to mail them to friends and relatives. And then he takes out a single $10 million check and signs it over to the family. It's a final redistribution of stolen wealth disguised as generosity. Some investigators believe this was Bernie's pre-suicide arrangement, a way of settling his conscience before ending his life. But Bernie didn't kill himself.
He didn't even try. He simply waited for the collapse to land on everyone else. Then, on December 11, 2008, he summoned his sons to his living room and made a confession. You recall the scene from the beginning of the story. The penthouse, the calm voice, the phrase, "It's all a big lie." His sons, Andrew and Mark, listened in horror. Their father had just confessed to the largest investment fraud in history. They walk out of the apartment, then straight to an attorney. And that attorney notified federal authorities immediately.
Bernie doesn't run. He doesn't hide. He doesn't flee to a country without extradition. He simply goes upstairs, sits in his chair, and waits. Because at this point, Bernie wasn't fighting to stay out of prison. He was fighting to control the narrative. And the next morning, at 4:59 a.m., FBI agents knock on the penthouse door. Bernie answers calmly, "We're here to arrest you," one of the agents announced. And Bernie calmly replied, "I know." He turns around, placed his hands behind his back, and was escorted out of the building in silence. 30 years of deception, ending not with a chase, but with surrender. But the real damage hadn't been calculated yet, because the destruction wasn't measured in dollars, it was measured in lives. This is the part of the story where the humor wears off, where the dark finance bro sarcasm fades out, and the human cost walks in. Because Madoff didn't just burn hedge fund managers and celebrities. He wiped out people who had trusted him with their survival. He destroyed families, towns, charities, foundations, and legacies. And the most devastating victims were the ones who had already survived the worst horrors of the 20th century. For many Jewish families, especially in New York, Florida, and parts of Europe, Bernie wasn't just a money manager. He was one of us. Someone safe. Someone trusted. Imagine Holocaust survivors losing everything for the second time. They had placed their reparations funds with him, their savings, their children's futures. And when the Ponzi collapsed, they lost everything twice, once in Europe, once in America. There is no punchline for that, just tragedy. Notable among those who lost their savings to Madoff was Elie Wiesel, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Holocaust survivor, global humanitarian. His personal savings were invested with Madoff. So was his charity, the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity. They lost more than $15 million. Money intended for education, refugee support, genocide prevention, humanitarian causes, gone. Wiesel later described Bernie Madoff as one of the greatest scoundrels, thieves, liars, criminals. The kind of disappointment that hits the soul, not the wallet. Kevin Bacon and Kira Sedgwick had nearly their entire retirement portfolio with Madoff. Bacon once said in an interview, "It was most of our money." That isn't celebrity gossip. That's devastation. Even town pension funds meant for firefighters, teachers, sanitation workers, and city staff were not spared. Entire municipal pensions evaporated. These weren't investors chasing alpha. These were civil servants expecting modest, steady retirements. Instead, they got a crater. More than 100 charities were wiped out. Scholarships revoked. Hospitals defunded. Research halted. Food banks collapsed. Bernie didn't just steal money. He stole futures. He stole safety. He stole hope. And as the scale of the devastation spread across the world, one question echoed louder than the rest. How did one man fool the entire financial system for 30 years? We'll get there. But first, justice had to make an appearance. And it did, in the most dramatic courtroom in modern financial history. But before then, let's circle back to the 17th floor. Not the 19th floor, the place where legitimate market making happened. Not the polished reception area where Bernie posed for Forbes and hugged trembling retirees in $8,000 suits. No. The 17th floor was something else. A financial crime scene disguised as an office. A forbidden zone where none of the real traders were allowed to set foot. A place where the world's biggest Ponzi scheme was stitched together with duct tape, fake statements, and the blind loyalty of a few hand-picked employees who never asked the right questions. Let's enter. Inside, you didn't find Bloomberg terminals humming with market data. You didn't hear the fast-talking energy of Wall Street traders shouting quotes. What you heard was a printer. A single, ancient, wheezing IBM AS400 printer spitting out thousands of pages of fake trade confirmations like a compulsive liar who wouldn't shut up. That printer was the heartbeat of the scam. And like any good heist movie, the heartbeat never skipped. If you've never heard of the split strike conversion strategy, don't worry, because neither had anyone else. Because in the real world, it didn't exist. Bernie told clients he was doing something elegant and conservative. Buy blue chip stocks, sell call options, buy put options. Create steady, hedged returns. It sounded sophisticated. It sounded safe. It sounded like something a benevolent financial wizard might do to protect your retirement. But here's the punchline. He never bought a single share. Not one. Not a single real trade in the entire $64.8 billion portfolio. Not in 1991, not in 1997, not in 2005. Never. The only thing he split was lies. The only thing he converted was trust into cash. The statements were so absurd that in some cases, the supposed trade volumes exceeded the entire daily trading volume of the actual stock. This wasn't suspicious. It was physically impossible. It was like claiming you bought every slice of bread ever baked in New York City in a single afternoon. And yet, nobody caught it. Bernie didn't use the brightest minds for the dirty work. He used the loyal ones. People who'd been with him for decades. People who grew up with him. People he paid well, gifted bonuses, and swaddled in job security. People who wouldn't dare question the man who was basically a demigod inside the building. They sat in that locked, windowless room filling in trade data by hand, adjusting spreadsheets to match whatever magical return Bernie needed that month. If the S&P fell 17%, Bernie returned plus 1%. If the NASDAQ soared 30%, Bernie returned plus 1%. Clockwork. Identical. Smooth as a sociopath's confession. One employee later testified, "We didn't even know what a hedge fund was. We were just told what numbers to type." Think about that. The biggest investment fraud in history was run by people who didn't even understand the industry they were faking. This wasn't Ocean's 11. This wasn't Mission Impossible. This was Office Space meets The Devil Wears Prada, powered by fear, loyalty, and Bernie's absolute control inside the building. Bernie kept two keys, one for his personal office, one for the fraud room. He guarded that second key like it was nuclear launch code. Visitors weren't allowed. Regulators weren't allowed. Even senior employees weren't allowed. An SEC investigator once showed up for a surprise visit. Bernie greeted him with a warm smile, walked him politely through the wrong floors, and never let him see the 17th at all. The SEC left satisfied. This is the same SEC that later admitted, "We did not understand the products we were supposed to be investigating." It's like asking someone to inspect a Boeing 747 when they can't tell the difference between the wing and the Wi-Fi antenna. Let's be brutally honest. The 17th floor wasn't sophisticated. It was stupid. So stupid, it became genius. People were expecting exotic derivatives, Byzantine strategies, high-frequency trading wizardry. Instead, Bernie gave them a dot matrix printer, a DOS-era computer, and fake trade logs typed into a system that was old when Michael Jackson released Thriller. And because no one could imagine that a man this respected, this admired, this legendary would risk everything on kindergarten-level fraud, nobody looked closely. Nobody checked the numbers. Nobody thought to ask, why does the greatest trader in America use technology older than disco? So how did one floor of fake trades stay hidden for 30 decades while thousands of investors were receiving statements so clean, so perfect, so impossibly consistent? That answer is even darker.
Because Bernie didn't build a Ponzi scheme. Bernie built a religion. A belief system so strong that people questioned themselves before they ever questioned him. These weren't desperate investors. They weren't day traders in sweatpants. They were the richest, most connected people in the world, sitting in boardrooms and private clubs begging to give Bernie their money. Palm Beach country clubs, Jewish charities in Manhattan, European aristocrats with estates in Provence and Cap d'Antibes, Hollywood actors who wanted safe returns. If you had money and a pulse, Bernie had a line open. Feeder funds didn't just invest money, they curated it, funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into Madoff's books each year. And they did it because they trusted the man who invented electronic trading, chaired the NASDAQ, and delivered a 10 to 18% return like a human thermostat. It wasn't just about returns. It was about status. I belong to the inner circle. I have a direct line to Wall Street royalty. I am safe. Because the truth is, nothing makes the ultra-wealthy panic faster than the idea of missing out on what everyone else already trusts. And Madoff's investors, they were sold belief, not strategy. Comfort, not due diligence. Lies wrapped in the illusion of exclusivity. It was genius, in the darkest sense of the word. The money flowed so fast, so predictably, it almost seemed like magic. If you ever wondered why nobody questioned Madoff, look no further than the famous clients who signed the checks and freely transferred their credibility to Madoff's scam. People like Kevin Bacon and Kyra Sedgwick, Steven Spielberg's foundation, Sir Evelyn Rothschild. Each name acted like a financial imprimatur. This man is trustworthy. He has earned it. The rest of you can follow. And people did, because social proof is stronger than math, stronger than logic, stronger than even the most obvious red flags. Here's how it worked. 1. A small fund would get a few lucky clients in. They'd post returns for a year or two, carefully consistent, carefully boring. Word spread, others begged to join. The feeder fund manager took a small commission, usually 1 to 2%, for introducing clients to the Wizard of Wall Street. The cycle repeated. By the early 2000s, these feeder funds were Bernie's secret army. Every single dollar collected was a new brick in the $64.8 billion wall of deception. And here's the kicker. The more legitimate he seemed, the more feeder funds begged for a piece of the pie. It was a feedback loop of trust, greed, and social proof. Bernie never advertised. No newsletters, no fancy brochures, no mass marketing. Exclusivity was the brand. Only sophisticated investors, only the right kind of client. Invitations required vetting. Only introductions from trusted sources allowed. And the rich loved it, because being able to say, "I'm invested with Bernie Madoff," was a badge of status, a way to measure superiority, a way to signal that you belonged in the rarefied air of the global elite. These funds, in theory, should have monitored the performance themselves. They could have done the math, checked volumes, verified trades, but they didn't, because it was easier to believe in the legend than the numbers. Because feeding a Ponzi isn't just about giving money. It's about participating in the illusion. And no one wants to be the fool who breaks the spell. So the more exclusive the fund, the more money poured in. The more money poured in, the more trust was reinforced. The more trust was reinforced, the longer the Ponzi survived. A self-reinforcing loop of stupidity.
By 2008, these feeder funds were massive. Hundreds of millions each year. Thousands of investors. Multiple countries. Billions of dollars flowing in from charities, pension funds, and sovereign wealth funds. The Ponzi didn't just survive. It thrived even during the dot-com bust and 9/11. The reason? Because the money coming in was so blind to reality, the scheme could afford to pay out to everyone else without anyone noticing. So how did the largest Ponzi in history keep feeding itself without collapsing? The answer lies in human psychology. Fear, greed, pride, and social proof, all marshaled by a man who understood them better than any trader understands risk. And when the collapse finally came, it wasn't just investors who suffered. It was the entire ecosystem Bernie had built. If there's one person in this story who deserves a medal for persistence, it's Harry Markopolos, hedge fund manager, a numbers guy, a forensic accountant disguised as a Wall Street cynic. And back in 1999, when he stumbled on the Madoff numbers, he recoiled in shock. He carefully analyzed the Madoff split-strike conversion strategy, the same mythical strategy Bernie bragged about. At first, he thought he was missing something. He ran the numbers over and over. He back-tested the performance. He cross-checked market volumes. And the results were impossible. The returns Bernie delivered weren't just improbable, they were mathematically impossible. 10 to 12% per year, rain or shine, plus 1% every single month for decades, even during the 2000 dot-com crash. Markopolos' notes. Madoff delivered 1.2% a month, every month, for 30 years. The S&P 500 wishes it had that kind of consistency. It wasn't just suspicious. It was absurd. By 2000, Markopolos had compiled a 21-page analysis titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." It included trade volume impossibilities, stock market inconsistencies, and notes showing Madoff could not have executed the strategy he claimed. He submitted it to the SEC, and they did nothing. 21 pages, clear evidence, and the agency tasked with preventing fraud shrugged. Markopolos went back. He called. He emailed. He begged. For 9 years, he kept screaming into a wall of indifference. The SEC's excuses were surreal. "We believe Mr. Madoff is trustworthy. We lack resources to investigate fully. His returns are consistent with sophisticated strategies." Markopolos later called it, "like yelling fire in a crowded theater, only the theater is blindfolded." The agency wasn't incompetent, at least not entirely. It was captured by perception. Madoff was a legend. He'd chaired the NASDAQ. He invented electronic trading. He donated millions to charities. Who could question a man like that? The SEC saw charisma, reputation, and awards instead of math, logic, and basic probability. This is where Wall Street's faith in trust becomes fatal. Markopolos kept insisting, "It's not just a fraud. It's impossible to exist as described."
Yet regulators continued to believe the myth rather than the math. By 2007, Markopolos was obsessed. He studied Madoff's operations like a detective. He traced feeder funds. He mapped flows from charities, celebrities, and European aristocrats. He built a mathematical model to demonstrate how no legitimate trades could produce those results. He even warned colleagues, "If this collapses, it will be the largest financial disaster in history. People will lose everything." They didn't believe him. Most didn't, because it was too monstrous to imagine. In 2008, Markopolos sent another memo to the SEC, a detailed, step-by-step guide of how Madoff could not possibly execute the trades. Comparisons with market volumes, options, and liquidity. Warning, you are looking at a fraud bigger than any in history. Act now or millions will be ruined. And nothing happened. He even testified in interviews. It was like trying to save someone who refuses to wake up from a coma. I was screaming into silence. Markopolos' frustration underscores the greatest paradox of Madoff's empire. It wasn't just the scam that was brilliant. It was how well the system ignored reality. Regulators trusted reputation over evidence. Feeder funds trusted exclusivity over logic. Investors trusted legacy over numbers. One man's lies lasted 30 years because everyone else chose comfort over truth. Markopolos had predicted the collapse years in advance. He had the roadmap. He had the evidence. And yet the SEC stumbled in place. Thousands of investors remained blind. And the Ponzi kept spinning. All because, as Markopolos would later say, people want to believe in the wizard, even when the curtain is falling. So when December 2008 came and investors demanded their money, the house of cards didn't just wobble. It shattered. The music stopped. The illusion collapsed. And the world finally saw the scale of Bernie Madoff's deception. If the 17th floor was the engine and the feeder funds were the fuel, then Bernie's lifestyle was the reward. Because no Ponzi scheme this massive survives without its king living like one. And Bernie, oh, he lived like a god among mortals. While billions were disappearing on the 17th floor, Bernie's life outside looked impeccable. Family dinners, yacht parties, philanthropy appearances, all carefully choreographed to maintain the illusion of legitimacy. And here's the bitterest irony. The more extravagant his lifestyle, the more trustworthy he seemed. People think, only a man with nothing to hide can live this openly. Except that's exactly what a master Ponzi artist counts on. The bigger the show, the less anyone questions the mechanics. The more everyone admires him. The more he can take. And he did take. December 2008. The world was already crumbling. The financial crisis had sent markets into a tailspin. Lehman Brothers had collapsed, and panic was contagious. And somewhere in Manhattan, on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building, the illusion finally hit a wall. Investors were panicking. Letters, emails, phone calls. Demands for redemption flooded the office. The math no longer worked. Promises of liquidity, rain or shine returns, decades of unwavering performance, all impossible to honor. Bernie's empire was exposed for what it really was, a $7 billion shortfall. Thousands of investors had trusted him with their entire lives, charities, pension funds, and individuals. And now, it was all gone. Some investors called it a financial Armageddon. Others called it incomprehensible. But for Bernie, it was just the end of the performance. The most trusted man on Wall Street was finally held accountable. The true scale of the devastation only became clear when investigators went through the client lists. Madoff's victims cut across every stratum of society. As long as you had money, Madoff was willing to take it. They had managed to save a little, rebuild a life, and then handed it over to a man they believed was trustworthy. The cruelty of the Ponzi scheme wasn't just financial. It was existential.
Madoff had created a system that preyed equally on the naive and the sophisticated. The human toll was staggering. Victims reported depression, anxiety, broken families, lost homes. It wasn't just about the money. It was faith, security, and dignity that were stolen. And yet, Wall Street itself barely flinched. Madoff's greatest weapon wasn't his skill with numbers. It was the facade of integrity. He weaponized reputation, social proof, and consistency, turning trust into a currency far more valuable than the dollars in his accounts. The victims, though, were collateral damage in a decades-long experiment in human psychology. Trust too easily given, authority too readily believed, greed too quietly indulged. So when the music finally stopped, it wasn't just a Ponzi that collapsed. It was faith in an entire financial ecosystem. And that ecosystem would take years, decades to untangle, if it ever truly recovered. When Bernie Madoff finally faced the law, it wasn't in some corporate boardroom or gilded office. It was a federal courtroom in Manhattan, packed with the very people he had betrayed. On March 12, 2009, Bernie Madoff entered the courtroom. No theatrics, no denials, no grandstanding. He simply pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies, including securities fraud, investment advisor fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. And with those words, the myth of Wall Street's most trusted man collapsed into reality. In June 2009, the judge delivered the hammer. You are sentenced to 150 years in prison. You are to serve this sentence consecutively without parole. The sentence wasn't just punitive. It was symbolic.
A recognition of the decades of deception, the billions stolen, the lives ruined. The courtroom was packed. Victims, reporters, and curious spectators all watched. Some cried. Some whispered, "Finally." For the first time, the world saw Bernie not as a titan of finance, but as the scoundrel that he was. Despite decades of deception, Madoff's calm, unflappable demeanor remained. Even facing 150 years, he seemed almost detached, a man who had mastered the art of lying with a poker face. It was the perfect end to the longest-running heist in history. A man who stole billions, ruined thousands, and slept like a baby until the very end. If you enjoyed this story, kindly give us a like and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications about future uploads. Our next episode promises to be even more exciting.